Hello everyone, I am Gui Valente and this is the Valente Brothers podcast. We're back for one more season, 2024. I'm here with Professor Pedro Valente.
Hello everyone, very happy to be back.
And Professor Joaquim Valente.
Hello everyone, happy to be here.
So once again, we're going to address many topics and please feel free to ask questions. We really value your contribution and your support in the comment section, of course, liking our page. But we're going to start talking about our teacher, the one who taught us Jiu-Jitsu, Grandmaster Helio Gracie. We have talked about him before in different episodes, but I think the moment right now really calls for this discussion. Unfortunately, I think due to many reasons, maybe the culture within BJJ, we have noticed that some have made even what we consider to be disrespectful comments. However, looking at it from a positive perspective, it's okay because it allows us also to initiate a conversation and to give credit to our teacher, who our father considered to be a genius, right? Specifically talking about his contributions to Jiu-Jitsu. And today we hear some individuals who never met Helio Gracie, who don't know Helio Gracie's Jiu-Jitsu, and that's what's very important. The only literature that Helio Gracie, technical literature that Helio Gracie left for us was a book with his techniques. But Helio Gracie was really not interested in, I believe, in sharing Jiu-Jitsu with those that were not by his side, right? He was open to teaching everyone, but he really valued a student that came to his school and wanted to learn. He thought that was important, that student-teacher relationship, somebody visiting him and meeting him, and of course, through that connection, then he was able to change that person's life through his techniques. So, Pedro, and of course, we're going to discuss this together. How can you summarize Helio Gracie's main contributions to Jiu-Jitsu?
Well, I think we have to focus on two aspects. One is his teaching methodology, which we've discussed at length, which I think is revolutionary and quite different than the teaching methodology that was used by Jigoro Kano, by the judo method. But what many people don't understand, especially because we don't have any footage, there's no video footage of Helio Gracie fighting or even teaching when he was in his prime. People only speculate about Helio Gracie's fighting techniques, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. Helio Gracie's contribution to Jiu-Jitsu, and when we say Helio Gracie's contribution, obviously we're not taking the credit from anybody else. It was a collective effort, especially when you're talking about Grandmaster Carlos Gracie, who was always next to him, and others who also contributed to this project, if you can call it that way. But Helio Gracie, I think that he was a visionary and he was ahead of his time, especially if we understand how martial arts are practiced today. The concept of mixed martial arts. He was doing that in the 1930s. Because even though he believed wholeheartedly that Jiu-Jitsu was a complete fighting system, but he was open-minded and willing to learn from specialists in the different elements of fighting.
And that was a moment in Grandmaster Helio's life that his focus was to be a fighter, right? Of course, he was a teacher, and that is how he always described himself, as a teacher. But in the 1930s, we're talking about Helio Gracie as a 20-year-old, 19-year-old.
Correct.
As he began his journey, he and his brothers shared a training center, an improvised training center, I believe in their home at the time, where they invited fighters from different styles, right, Joaquim? There were capoeira fighters, wrestlers, catch wrestlers, boxers. So they were constantly exchanging ideas. Helio Gracie always, I think he probably absorbed that from his older brother, like you mentioned, Carlos Gracie, but always believing in Jiu-Jitsu as a very complete fighting system, but open to understand possibly even some of his, for the lack of a better word, enemies, right? Studying his opponents, studying his adversaries, and learning more about what they could do to him.
For example, his kicking abilities. I doubted that came from the Japanese, even though it's present in systems of karate and Japanese arts. But I believe that his abilities, his dexterity in kicking, came from capoeira. Oh, so he was practicing capoeira? No, he was trying to improve his jiu-jitsu, but he was training with capoeira representatives and learning from them.
And on a side note, I think it's important to mention that the capoeira practiced at that time was different in ways. We have a friend of ours in Brazil who's a jiu-jitsu researcher, the history of jiu-jitsu, and he often talks about what at the time was referred to as capoeira carioca.
Yes.
Which was more of a fighting style of capoeira.
Yes.
Right?
And I think
without some of the folkloric elements.
And I think when we look at the impact through Grandmaster Helio's vision of allowing this connection with other martial arts so that he could specialize and improve in different aspects, it's important for us to look at the history. Because when we understand the history and the limited exposure that Carlos had to Jiu-Jitsu, coming from Japan for only training for maybe 2 years with Mitsui Maeda, then we know that they were exposed to a complete version of Jiu-Jitsu. So they knew that Jiu-Jitsu was complete, but they knew that they lacked elements of technique in some different areas. And that's where they were always very open to improve their striking through boxing, improve their kicking abilities through capoeira and catch wrestling and all that.
For sure. And that's a key point. The fact that Helio Gracie was a fighter. Because as you know, the rules of the game that you play, the rules of the sport that you engage in, will usually define the technique in many ways. And so when you look at the history of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil, and you look at what was happening in the 1930s, there was a huge argument, a huge discussion about rules for combat in the Jiu-Jitsu world. Be it no holds barred competitions or Jiu-Jitsu grappling only style matches. And this argument always revolved around the use of points. In Japan, points were being used for the throws and for the pins. You pin somebody for 30 seconds, you win the match. You throw somebody with a complete throw, you win the match. And the Gracie brothers, Carlos and Helio, they always refused to fight with points because they understood the original Jiu-Jitsu rules to be that you could only win by knockout or submission. Either somebody passes out or they tap out. And that is huge because that defined their strategy. Judo, where you can win by pins, if we're talking specifically about grappling, I think this is a very important point. There's no hierarchy of pins. All the pins are the same because as long as you hold the guy down for 30 seconds, you win. So you get him in a honkezagatame, in a head and arm pin, and you hold him down, you win. So that's as good as the mounted position, for example. Helio Gracie, since his victory was only defined by catching the person or knocking the person out, he understood that the mounted position was superior to all the other pins. So you look at a judo match. You've trained judo before, all of us did. And you remember that they always look for the easier pin to get to, the headlock pin, the head and arm pin, kezagatame. But in Jiu-Jitsu, the jiu-jitsu we practice and we learn from Helio Gracie, that's not enough. You pass the guard, you side mount, you mount, because the mount is the superior position to win, be it in a fight through strikes, be it through submissions. So when people criticize Helio Gracie's strategy, they usually say, well, it was basic newaza. Because they say every technique that you see in Helio Gracie's repertoire can be found in the judo books. In fact, if you look at Tsunetane Oda, if you look at some of the teachers of the same generation, their repertoire was much more extensive. The number of techniques was much greater. And that proves that their jiu-jitsu was more sophisticated than Helio Gracie's. I disagree with that, because I think the number of techniques does not define the effectiveness of a system.
So I believe that this point that you're touching on is probably Helio Gracie's greatest contribution to Jiu-Jitsu. Helio Gracie's Jiu-Jitsu was minimalistic, right? And as students of the martial arts, but also as students of other disciplines, I think we can all agree that a minimalistic approach is very difficult to achieve, because it requires a very good filter. What is it that you're going to learn? What are the techniques that you're going to learn? If you're only going to use a few of them, but the techniques that are really going to make one effective, right? I think there's a big difference between being a teacher and sometimes having to expose one to many different scenarios and many different situations, but compared to what you need to be effective, right? This is a question that students always ask. Do I need to learn 30 different strolls? Do I need to learn 40 different chokes? Or should I just have a few moves that I can work on and that I can really perfect and that will allow me to defend myself?
It goes back to a quote attributed to Bruce Lee that says, fear the man who practices one kick 10,000 times than a man who practices 10,000 kicks one time each.
Correct. So what happens, Joaquim, I think that there is a issue today compared to at that time, talking about Helio Gracie's time, especially through the internet and through this way, this mechanism of selling jiu-jitsu, right? Which is today a reality. All over the world, we see many great jiu-jitsu practitioners, sportive sport champions and self-defense experts and many different disciplines, not only in jiu-jitsu. And when you're selling a technique, right, if you only have a few techniques to sell, you can only make so much money. So in order to be profitable and in order to keep that process, right, going, you need more and more techniques.
Yeah.
And it reminds us of something that Helio Gracie used to say. Even among his instructor body, right, he would be very upset when he noticed an instructor was doing the following. He was creating a problem that is many times inexistent, according to him, was inexistent, just in order to come up with a technique to solve a problem that in the first place is really not a problem, because it's really not realistic, right? And I believe that's part of what we're experiencing right now. There is a constant attempt, and I don't think anyone does this purposefully, but if you have to come up with material to sell, you need to come up with techniques. You need to come up with more and more and more and more and more and more. And who out there is really absorbing all that in a realistic way?
And because new toys are always more fun, right? Like a kid that has a very expensive toy, but he's had it for a few months, and then he gets a very cheap toy, but it's new. He's going to play with the new toy.
Because it's easier, right? Because you can make a technique, and Grandmaster Helio was amazing at that, a technique that you've seen so many times, and to make a very interesting conversation, to talk about deeper details and strategy on the use of that technique. So I think I agree with what Guy said 100%, and I think a lot of it is based on it's much easier to have a new technique every day to make the class interesting. But when you talk about really, I believe the power of Jiu-Jitsu that we learned from Grandmaster Helio, which is strategy, art of anticipation, patience,
the principles,
right? The principles, then it becomes a much more technical class, and one that the instructor needs to be able to feel the student, to be able to see how the student is reacting, so that you can really help him to improve on the techniques that are more realistic, as Guy said, to a street situation.
Correct.
And Pedro,
And that's
this
the point.
This is not what I said. Just to
It's not a criticism.
yeah, it's not it's not a criticism on those that are looking for those techniques, right? I think it's normal. You want to see it, right? It requires a lot of an understanding of how to be a student. It's very difficult, right? You need a filter. I think that this is more of a positive criticism, aside from this discussion, maybe for the instructors, right? Because you're almost taking advantage of very impressionable students out there, as Joaquim said, that want to learn what's new, that want to have that new toy, rather than getting into these very deep conversations, which was Helio Gracie's Jiu-Jitsu. Let's talk about a lot of what even one of his sons talks about, the invisible Jiu-Jitsu, yeah? Rickson. That's what Helio Gracie was always doing with his techniques.
Always trying to find the detail that would make the difference.
Correct.
But then I think that this happens so much that you end up losing what are the foundations, right? Because there are some technical, and I think when Grandmaster Helio would talk about his book.
You mean when it's too much about the new technique?
Yeah, new techniques, always something new, 10,000 different options of sweeps and how to grab the sleeve and how to do this and do that. You lose the basics. And I think Grandmaster Helio, when he would talk about that book, he would say, these are the techniques that I believe are the most important for someone who's learning Jiu-Jitsu to know.
Yeah.
And I think it's common for us to see that, and again, we don't say this as a criticism, but it impresses me because there's different styles of teaching and there's different curriculums and different schools. But when someone shows up and I mount on top of them and I say, do the bridge escape, the UPA, and they don't know.
Correct, because they are spending so much time.
And they know a lot of other things.
But Joaquim, let me just say this, because you touched on the book, because there's the other side of the coin also when it comes to the book. Because if you look at the techniques only by themselves, especially if you did not have contact with Helio Gracie as a teacher, if Helio Gracie was not teaching you Jiu-Jitsu, you could look at those techniques and say, oh, that's too basic. But if you understood, for example, a lot of the stand-up self-defense techniques against surprise attacks, they teach a solution, but they also teach a throw. Let's just try to talk about quickly here, Pedro and Joaquim, let's come up with, even using judo terminology and strikes, what techniques are taught? Let's start with judo, with the throws. Judo, Jiu-Jitsu, but let's use the Japanese terminology. Osotogari is taught.
Taiotoshi is taught. Koshiguruma is taught. Ogoshi is taught.
Ouchigari.
Ouchigari is taught. Osotogari is said. Osototoshi is taught.
Tanyotoshi.
Tanyotoshi is taught.
Now, you can learn these
Yokoguruma.
and then you dive deep in understanding each of these techniques. You learn double leg.
And that's without counting the variations of Harai Goshi and Makikomi, Soto Makikomi.
Double leg, I'm not sure if Helio Gracie, in his book, no.
No.
Helio Gracie did not really, we can say this, he did not really like the double leg. It's interesting.
Yeah.
He did not like it
because
he loved the guillotine.
Correct.
He loved the guillotine.
Yes.
So what about striking? We're talking about what Helio Gracie considered to be his jiu-jitsu, the first 40 lessons. You learn a back elbow. You learn a straight elbow. You learn, there's even a punch, right? A hook
Yes.
to the
The
jaw
chin.
with a fist,
Yes.
right?
Knee
We know,
strike.
I don't think it's in the book, but Helio Gracie taught all the palm strikes.
Sure.
Yeah? You learn knee strike. You learn a diagonal knee strike, right? You learn strike, a knee strike to the face. You learn a diagonal knee strike to the body.
Side kick.
Side kick.
To the knee, to the body, both.
To the body. So if you look at it just from a this technique, and then you're going to also perform those techniques poorly. But if you dissect the moves and you have to be a student.
Exactly, and that's my point.
Of the art.
And also,
was this book, when Grandmaster Helio did this book, did he ever had the intention of teaching Jiu-Jitsu through this book?
No.
And that's the problem. There's people taking the book nowadays and trying through the book learn these techniques. It's not going to work.
Yeah, correct. And the thing is that even the attacks, when you learn how to attack, you learn techniques as well. For example, there's a front kick defense. You're learning how to throw a front kick. And Helio Gracie taught us to be attackers, how to throw those attacks in the most realistic way. Even the stick techniques. I think those stick techniques that we
like club.
use.
Talking about the club.
Club,
the bat.
yeah, the bat. I think that's a lost art of stick fighting, Brazilian street fighting, stick fighting from that time that we've learned by learning how to attack. Because Grandmaster Helio would always tell me, when we attack, especially from the close distance, the technique was very hard to learn. And he used to say, people in the street know how to attack like that.
Have we found any evidence of the club defenses, bat defenses in Japanese books?
Yes, they have.
Different. No?
But not exactly like he taught, no.
Because the knives, I've seen a lot more. But
yeah.
the sticks, now that you said that, the bat defenses,
it's not.
It'll be interesting to go back to some of the literature. If anyone has any evidence, please share it with us.
And I think this is, a proof of Grandmaster Helio's dedication to the art. I don't think there are too many people that dedicated themselves so much to Jiu-Jitsu like we saw Grandmaster Helio. He was always, ready to step into the mat as a fighter, but as a teacher to be able to improve his abilities to defend, to be able to look at a technique that maybe didn't cover a specific attack.
Come up with solutions.
I remember one time, we used to do a group class with 2 different children at the time. We were young, and we would always ask questions, right? And I think kids do that in a natural way. They try to ask hard questions to the adults. And we would always try to ask hard questions to Grandmaster Helio. And I remember one time it was a specific gun defense that we were doing, and it caught him in a way that he didn't have an answer. He's like, interesting, we don't have a specific technique for this. And in the moment, he started testing it out and calling people, and let's try this, let's try that. And in a matter of minutes, we came up with a solution that he wanted to continue to, test for the next months to be able to see if that worked or not. So, that just showed the spirit that he had towards Jiu-Jitsu, and I think that's what gave him the ability to contribute so much to the art.
So some people say, Helio Gracie's Jiu-Jitsu practiced until the 1990s was just basic Judo Newaza. The main reason why that's not true is because they practiced under they trained and they fought under a different set of rules that created a different objective. The objective was to win the fight definitively. And that led to a different approach. So I think we should discuss specifically the differences between Judo Newaza that was practiced at the time and the Jiu-Jitsu that was practiced by Helio Gracie. I talked about the mounted position, the emphasis on mounting. And if we look at that challenge match that happened in the 1970s between karate and jiu-jitsu, we don't have a lot of footage, but if we look at those fights, every single fight is the same thing. Takedown, mount, and win from the mount. If you look at the first UFCs that Royce fought, always the same thing. Takedown, always mount. A judo guy would not have that same objective approach.
I understand what you're trying to do, and I think we can come up with a lot in that respect. But I think there's a few people saying these things about Helio Gracie's Jiu-Jitsu being basic and that after, and we have even friends that say that, and I respect.
It's not just that it's basic; it's that there's no innovation, there's no contribution.
Got it. So Helio Gracie's Jiu-Jitsu was for fighting. Unfortunately, fighting has been around for a long time. So, of course, Helio Gracie's style, Helio Gracie raised awareness to many different techniques and many different approaches to the fighting science. But what happened later, and I think that's really the issue, was that a certain sport was created, which is BJJ today, that year after year, and
With a specific point system.
Exactly, changed.
That didn't exist before.
That did not exist before. And that slowly, or maybe not so slowly, is becoming further and further away from a fight, right? And the best jiu-jitsu practitioners in the world today, they are the first ones to admit if they have to change from BJJ to MMA, they need sometimes a year, 2 years of adaptation because they have to learn how to strike. BJJ does not teach striking. BJJ
but
prohibits
even the
striking.
ground.
Correct. We're going to get there. BJJ prohibits. And for those of you that don't know, BJJ does not allow striking. When I say BJJ, it's the sport of BJJ that now is widely practiced. And that's how it's referred to, BJJ. The federation is IBJJF, correct? Okay. This federation, the rules prohibit any type of striking. You cannot use open hand strikes. You cannot use kicks. If you do that in BJJ, you're disqualified, right? You avoid your opponent, right? You stop your opponent from scoring points by exposing your back, by turning to your knees or stomach, right? Just like judo and wrestling. Contradicting the original, one of the most original, right, principles of jiu-jitsu, which is to never give your back.
Yes, but going back to Judo Newaza, when judo was implemented, they already had the pin rule. And that caused judo practitioners already at that time to turn their backs.
And this was a great difference between Helio Gracie's jiu-jitsu and all the judokas that we...
Now somebody's going to come with one book from few guys
hold on.
who said, oh, they said never to turn the back. But that would have died if it wasn't for Helio Gracie.
Correct. But you understand
because
the point.
who continued that?
Correct. And I understand. But it's just that let's cut to the chase.
No, but that's the point. I want to cut to the chase. I think we should talk, since we're talking about Helio Gracie's contributions, technique. I think people want to know. What else? The mount. For example, defending strikes from the guard.
But let me just then complete what I was going to say. So the ones today that are saying that they developed techniques, and we see them in sport, jiu-jitsu, BJJ, these techniques are never used in MMA. And MMA is not a street fight. There are rules as well. And that's the point. It's something that Helio Gracie had absolutely no interest in.
Correct.
So it's completely unfair, right? It's intellectual dishonesty to make this comparison. Or we're talking about mixing, what is it in English you say, mixing apples with oranges.
Exactly. Or it's ignorance, not calling the person ignorant, but it's because it's a big confusion. And now that you're saying this, as I think that Grandmaster Helio's biggest contribution, and obviously you need to give credit on this also to Carlos, is that they refused to accept the changes that would have killed the style that we practice today. And now, why Grandmaster Helio? Because it didn't happen once.
Yes.
It happened twice, at least.
And a lot of people say,
Helio Gracie
right?
then accepted with the Jiu-Jitsu Federation.
But then he got out.
Yes.
Yes.
So
He
that's my
accepted
point.
until he didn't.
Exactly. So when the Japanese diplomatic mission, right? It was a diplomatic mission, arrived in Brazil, and they gave Grandmaster Helio the highest ranking of judo in Brazil at the time. Is that correct?
The black belt, which
There are some debates, but
but they
Exactly.
in that ceremony he received the black belt. We don't know directly from whose hands, but
we
yes.
can say there was an intention in that gathering to try to influence them to change the
100%.
style in which they were practicing.
Yes.
And that mission failed.
Yes.
They said, thank you very much, but no, we're going to continue practicing under the system and the style that we basically learned from Mitsui Maeda, and then through other people also, that there was an influence, and they stayed true to that.
But even before the emissaries, already in the early 30s, there were people already pushing for points, saying in Japan they're using points, you guys are not.
And they stayed true.
And there are a lot of people who say that, no, the Gracies were lying. They invented those rules to benefit themselves. They claimed that those were the original Jiu-Jitsu rules, but they were just inventing those rules to benefit themselves because they weren't good at the throws and they weren't good at the pins. So they wanted to do that in that way so they could draw and they could,
I agree, but let me just make a hook with what Guy said because I think it's very interesting. Yeah, a connection. What happens here is this. So then when the Jiu-Jitsu Federation is created with Grandmaster Helio, right, and other people around, then the same thing happens. This style of self-defense starts to be changed into something completely different.
Yes.
And then the comparison that they make today to what they practice has nothing to do with the intention that Grandmaster Helio fought.
And Helio Gracie would not want to be involved.
But you guys are advanced. You guys are talking about the comparison between Helio Gracie and BJJ, which is I'm back to
that's
Newaza.
very important, Pedro, because what's causing us to have this conversation is exactly the claims that these people are making, comparing Grandmaster Helio's technique to something today that is not
but what they say is
with the same intention.
But what they say is this. Helio Gracie's technique was basic judo newaza. So I wanted to start with that.
Yeah, that's obviously false.
We should talk
we
about
already debunked that.
Yeah.
No, I think we should continue.
The rules were different. How could it be?
But now we have to talk about the contributions. What were the technical contributions?
But let me then go back
because to me very important.
Right? Chronologically, I'm going to talk about his contributions, and then you can talk about what you consider his contributions, maybe more in the Jiu-Jitsu versus Jiu-Jitsu world.
No.
Okay, so his contributions, in my opinion, were a system of fighting that included strikes, that included takedowns, that included ground grappling techniques, right? With an emphasis on your ability to fight someone who's bigger and stronger than you, right? Helio Gracie, he told me this. If I can block punches, take somebody down, mount an arm lock, I'll do that. But I'm also ready to fight somebody much bigger and stronger who's going to put me in a bad position, and I'll have to survive.
So specifically, let's talk about that.
And stand-up self-defense against surprise attacks.
Yeah, I'm talking more about like the challenge aspect of it.
But let me talk about that right now.
So he combined that, and let's add what Joaquim just said, the surprise. So who else was doing that in?
Yeah, but let's be specific. I want to be specific. Which Judo Newaza book you know or you have found from that time that talks specifically about a system
of defending punches from the guard? Defending
punches from the guard, strikes from the guard.
And we tried to look for it, right? We can't look at all the books we have behind us. We are really trying to find this. I found the triangles. I found arm locks. I have never found any books.
Now, a sophisticated system of striking from bottom guard with palm strikes and kicks and elbows and all of that as Helio Gracie had.
I've never seen it. Now, I admit that someone else could have been doing that.
Sure.
So if the purpose here is to say that Helio Gracie invented this, right? I don't think he did. Just like all this other stuff that's around, probably who really invented it, right?
Yes.
There's a famous guard, a hook that people attribute to a Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner, the outside hook we call it, and now we see the Japanese doing it, right? So that's really the point.
Doing it back
then.
1930s, correct.
Yeah. So, but yes.
So I just wanted to talk about some specific examples. Now, if you want to talk about Jiu-Jitsu versus Jiu-Jitsu, the sophisticated system of defense. Because I know a lot of people who are watching us are Jiu-Jitsu people. And I want to address this specifically. The sophisticated system of defense against side mount attacks, Jiu-Jitsu attacks.
Never seen in any judo book.
Why not? Because they would lose by pin, so why would they develop that?
Correct. But Pedro, the problem, and I don't say this, it's not about, it possibly can sound like arrogant. Oh, I don't want to talk about that. But we know that this is coming from Jiu-Jitsu black belts. Unfortunately, the Jiu-Jitsu culture, the BJJ culture.
There are people in the judo community also that.
Yeah. So judo as well. Unfortunately, it's what Joaquim said. There's a lot of ignorance.
Yeah, but
right?
let's enlighten.
But why is there ignorance? There's ignorance because Helio Gracie did not write books, did not write manuals, right, outside of his organization. He had curriculums. He was very organized. But the only literature that he wrote in the book was the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu master text. So individuals don't know that. And when someone says that, it's so far from reality that my instinct is like, we don't even have to waste time with such a comment.
And there is a lot of discussion.
Maybe my personality, I like to
argue.
Not to argue, but to prove the point.
There's too much discussion, Pedro, on this technique. Oh no, but I found in a book something that looks similar to this. So he did not invent. So because he did not invent, then he shouldn't have credit. And Grandmaster Helio was a philosopher. His strategy was something deep that is hard even to write in a book, and it wasn't written. So most people that never met Grandmaster Helio is going to have a very hard time to give credit on a contribution that they have no understanding of. Yeah, so and then if we bring the discussion into techniques, then they might win that discussion. Because as we always say, nothing is created, nothing is destroyed, everything is transformed.
So the point that I'm making is that exactly what Keith said earlier. It's a minimalistic and objective approach to fighting. You cannot define which technique or which system is more advanced based on number of techniques. His approach, as you said, was for fighting, and that's the difference. That he was practicing for a fight. And the rules, the absence of rules, or the limited amount of rules, is what created a specific strategy that was quite different, and that's the point that I'm trying to make, from the judo that was practiced back then. If there was anybody else practicing something similar, it would have died if it wasn't for Grandmaster Helio, Grandmaster Carlos, and the contributions of students of theirs who continue this until today.
Yeah, I believe the best way to answer that question for those of you that want to learn about Helio Gracie's Jiu-Jitsu is to come to Miami, spend some time here in Miami, great place for you to visit, and learn Jiu-Jitsu here from us, because we try to really keep that Jiu-Jitsu alive. But, you know, to try to connect, oh, this person is related to Helio Gracie, no. Unfortunately, that's not the truth.
What do you mean this person is related?
No, if this person is related to Jiu-Jitsu, there's some type of family connection. Oh, that means if this is the Jiu-Jitsu practiced right now by a family member, this is what Helio Gracie was doing. That's not how you will understand Helio Gracie's Jiu-Jitsu. The truth is that it's very rare today to find individuals who are focused in teaching that style of Jiu-Jitsu because
the sport became so prevalent.
A lot of people like to win medals and to participate in these events. And if you're participating in these events, you cannot even afford, time-wise, focus-wise, to learn knife defense, to learn a bear hug defense, to learn punches from the guard, to learn how to survive on the bottom without having to escape, because you're going to lose your BJJ match, right? Time will run out and you're going to lose. Or you're not going to have to, right, learn against a headlock, because nobody headlocks you in BJJ usually. Nobody tries to stab you in a BJJ match. So that's the point. We're trying to keep these episodes short. We already went overtime. So if you have any questions, please send it to us. Don't forget to like our page, to send your comments, and to share, most importantly, this with your friends. Thank you very much.